1999, Morpheus offered Neo a choice between a red pill and a blue pill. In 2018, this country fractured between red and blue. In 2022, I'm here to tell you that if you really want the truth, more voters are neither red or blue. Yet, they have no representation, no choice, and no options. They have to choose between candidates chosen by the red people or the blue people. I'm David Esrati, and I'm running for Congress as an American, as in red, white, and blue. I'm a veteran, an activist, and a small businessman. I'm asking you to join me in reminding the professional politicians in Congress who their bosses are. I support ranked choice voting, campaign finance reform, and a verified voter information system, all so we can stop having the best politicians money can buy. It's time to elect a veteran who will work for you, no matter what color they want to label you. Please go to electesrati.com and learn more. I'm David Esrati, and I approve this message. In Jurassic Park, you thought those little baby dinosaurs were cute until they turned into out-of-control carnivores. That's sort of what happens to government when we elect people based on very expensive advertising campaigns and propaganda. I'm David Esrati. I'm a veteran and a small businessman running for Congress. You don't want professional ad people and pollsters to sway your vote. All those hot-button issues like gun control, abortion, borders are all politicized to stop you from voting rationally. And thinking rationally seems to be in short supply these days. Most Americans have been voting against their own best self-interest for a long time because we've allowed money to buy our leaders. 1 million Americans died in the last 2 years because our leaders couldn't lead. It wasn't that hard. Mask, distance, test, and then vaccinate. In an instant, we had billions to spend on healthcare for COVID, when for years we've been told we can't provide healthcare for everyone equally in this country. That's an unintended consequence of the pandemic. If you think about it, our government can pretty much do whatever it wants, or what the people who buy our politicians tell our leaders to do. We also had a ton of money to prop up businesses. The next thing you know, it turns out that a living wage was not only possible, but necessary. As a small businessman who won't sell you out to corporate interests and lobbyists, I can tell you that it's time to fully understand the consequences of companies like Amazon, Facebook, and Google and their effect on small business, and to remind you that small business is the #1 creator of jobs in this country. So this next election, don't trust this ad or any other political ad. Do your homework and think before you vote. It's time to put this ad man in Congress because I know that the best advertising is based on the truth, not the size of the budget or payola. Or you can just vote based on who has the money to buy their way into Congress and live with the consequences. I'm David Esrati, and I approve this message. Hi, I'm David Esrati. Happy Friday. Another beautiful weekend for going out and putting up signs, campaigning, talking to voters, and everything else. So, first off, there was a story in the Dayton Daily News this morning by Josh Swigert about me and Mr. Turner, and it was pretty good, all in all, except for one slight problem. His recording of my position on gun control was not quite correct. I said I believe that in a strict interpretation of the Second Amendment, which means you must be part of a well-regulated militia if you are going to have semi-automatic weapons. I believe that you're fine with single-shot weapons, 5-shot internal magazines for rifles or for shotguns, but no actual clip-fed, belt-fed, anything else, and no, we've just got to simplify this. And I said that if you want to have a weapon in public, You are in uniform. You are in uniform. Sorry. You are in uniform, you are with somebody else, and you are doing training, etc. So let's get that out of the way. Now, second thing was yesterday, Roshan Winburn went to jail with a $100,000 bond. I wrote about it on Esrati.com. Roshan is a little part of the culture of corruption investigation. And apparently a lot of people don't understand the full scope and scale of this. I had a window seat because of my relationship primarily with Brian Higgins, who used to own Sidebar and then Quincy's Chicken and Fish, a company that did body removal for Montgomery County and one in Chicago. Now, Brian is a paratrooper just like me. I've known the guy he refers to as his father, was one of the first people I met in Dayton. Brian's a good friend. He's also a client. So I'm full disclosure here. You know, that's that. I am not going to say that I believe everything I hear from Brian or trust everything I hear from Brian ever. He was a cash on delivery customer. I never extended him credit. I do know a lot of the parts and pieces of what happened in the whole scheme of things. And I don't think most people put all this together. So let's get right out from the beginning, start out with what the culture of corruption investigation was. Operation Demolished Integrity came to light on April 30th of 2019. With great fanfare at the downstairs of the federal building, we had our state attorney general, Dave Yost. We had Ben Glassman from the Department of Justice, the prosecuting attorney. We had Joe Dieters from the FBI all get up and say they were so happy that they've, put a dent in the culture of corruption, and they announced the indictments of 4 black men. I'll say that again. 4 black men. Those 4 black men, in order of public reputation knowledge, Clayton Lucky, who had been on the Dayton School Board and had been a state rep and had already been to prison for time for 3 years for misusing campaign funds. Joey D. Williams, who had been on the school board for 2 terms and on the Dayton City Commission for 5 terms. Roshan Winburn, who had been a Huber Heights councilman and then was working for the City Minority Business Development Group, which approves contracts for diversity. And Brian Higgins, as I said, the small businessman. Now, Roshan's father was off to the side. His father was Roland Winburn, who had been a state rep and was a party insider. Because, of course, as you should know, Montgomery County is run by a monarchy of both people in the Democratic Party and the Republican Party who have done deals for years. That's why the prosecutor is never challenged. That's why the sheriff is never challenged. That's why judges are appointed, once they get elected, they are in for life. They never, ever get taken off the bench. The only exception was when some royalty got elected and was incompetent. That was Judge Cromartie McGee, who was the daughter of former Dayton Mayor James H. McGee. And she was challenged by Richard Skelton, who was a Democrat and became a Republican, to run against her and spend $250,000 of his own money to unseat her. Other than that, you become a judge, you're good for life. So, back to the culture of corruption. We had these 4 black men, and they were accused of from the indictments about $250,000 of naughtiness. That's all we heard about, $250,000. So when they were done with their prosecution and their idea of how all this was going to work, they opened up for questions, and I was the furthest one to their left, and I had my video camera and I raised my hand and I said, so you mean to tell me that all the corruption in Dayton is only done by black men? And from what I read from the indictments, maybe $250,000. You had $130 million go missing at Wright State. There was a finding of guilt and nobody was prosecuted. Not a single person. Not an administrator, not a board member, not a trustee, not anybody who worked at the university. $130 million disappeared of public money. We know they caused problems with H-1B visas, and yet you're saying this is the culture of corruption? Ben Glassman, the prosecutor for the state, for the feds, looked like I'd shot his puppy. He didn't know what to do. Mr. Winburn Sr.'s over at the side giving me the big thumbs up saying, way to go. And then I started digging into all this. Now, of course, I knew a little more than most because Brian Higgins, who has been sent for a mental evaluation by Judge Rose much later, was already ticked off about what had happened to him in Chicago. He used to have a multi-million-dollar contract to remove dead bodies in the city of Chicago. That multi-million-dollar contract, for some reason, he didn't rebid. He lost the contract, and it was given to a man who was a convicted sex offender. And Brian had binder after binder of materials that he'd gathered to explain this case, and it had me helping him put these things together. And just the night before this indictment, he was going down to the FBI office down on Clio Road with his attorney, Michael Wright, and a pastor, because that's the way Brian rolls, to explain to them this. And he walks in there with his binders, thinking that he's going to meet with FBI to discuss Chicago, as he always would just call it. And instead, he was handcuffed and indicted. I believe Roshan was already sitting there, and Joey came in on his own a little later. So, we have these 4 black men, and they make it out like this was a big deal. And immediately, a day or so later, or maybe that day, I write a piece on my blog. There's a link down below on YouTube talking about culture of corruption, but only if you're black. And the process begins. Now, during the course of this, Mr. Higgins is provided by the feds all the documents they are going to use in the prosecution so he can prepare his defense. That's called discovery. That's supposed to be given to the defendants only and their lawyer for them to evaluate, to review, to know what's going on. Brian gave me a copy of that. He wasn't supposed to do it. And in that, on pages 181, 182, 183, that's just, and then 184, these are unclassified documents. These are by Case Agent Matthew DeBlois, Cincinnati Field Office, Squad 17, and they're dated 10/2 of 2015. 10/2 of 2015. That means Mr. Williams was 1 year into his 5th term. And he is talking to the FBI as a confidential human source. Now, it's been redacted, and I'm not supposed to know who this CHS is. However, I've been in this town a long time. I've known Commissioner Williams for a long time. I've known a lot of these people, and in here, there's the thing about the fashion show he had as a fundraiser. There was issues about how he didn't want to open a chicken place because he'd already gotten burned on the Popeyes that he had. There is fascinating stuff with his opinions of some of the other public officials who are probably still wondering when the shoe is going to drop on them. But they first started out asking questions about Marlon Shackelford and also about Tommy Owens, who are entertainment producers. And there wasn't a whole lot there except there was money running through Omega CDC. Omega CDC is Omega Baptist Church. That is the Reverend Darrell Ward. Now, I want you to remember Darrell Ward because later Darrell Ward is asked by the party to run in the special election to fill Commissioner Williams' seat against Commissioner Darrell Fairchild. Figure out how this works? Again, the Friends and Family program. There, he was also asked about Willis Blackshear's plans for his political future. Willis Blackshear at the time was the county recorder. You probably know the name Willis Blackshear now because his son, Willis Blackshear Jr., is a state rep and running unopposed. Blackshear, it later turns out, was supposedly the bagman picking up money from Steve Roush's office and delivering it to Mayor Whaley. Although it doesn't seem like in the documents we've seen that were unsealed by a federal judge 3 weeks after I filed my FOIA request. We'll get to that later. But 3 weeks later, they released these, and they had a tail on Blackshear for quite a while. Blackshear died, and according to FOIA, which is Freedom of Information Act law, you can no longer hide documents under privacy things for people who are dead. So that should have been released, and they refused. Well, actually, they told me there were no records, which I said, that's crazy because you already have a warrant that you've unsealed that had all this information, wiretaps and everything. So they also asked Williams about Whaley. Here are the exact words of Joey Williams about Nan Whaley, according to the FBI. Now, one of the things that bothers me about the FBI is they don't record everything. They write it down. They don't believe in tape recordings. So they get spelling mistakes and they get some other problems. But while speaking of Whaley, the CHS said she was an emotional person. The CHS said small things such as someone shaking one of Whaley's opponent's hand could set her off. The CHS described Whaley as being thin-skinned, but at times very tough. The CHS said loyalty is everything to her. The CHS added that Whaley's loyalty went both ways, meaning if you were loyal to Whaley, she would be loyal to you. Then they asked about Citywide Development Corporation, and for some reason he could not remember Steve Budd's name. Then, that was the man, name unknown, came to the commission meetings and would give updates on the various demolition projects. Then they talk about Aaron Sorrell, who used to be the head of planning. Then they asked about Steve Roush, who did most of the demolition in the city. Roush was later not indicted, but charged, and he got off with a $15,000 fine. His name was released. This was in November of 19, along with that of Joyce Cameron, who is the former mayor of Trotwood, and her older husband. I can't remember his first name. I believe it's James Cameron, but I'm probably getting the movie guy. They had a company called Green Star Trucking, which was a minority-owned trucking company that Roush would use as a subcontractor, although it seems Roush owned the trucks. So they talk about Roush. And now the important thing to know about Steve Roush is his right-hand man used to be a man named Mike Marshall. Mike Marshall was a dishonorably discharged Army veteran. At some point, Marshall and Roush parted ways. Marshall became a confidential human source, an informant for the FBI and the DOJ, and they set up a fake company called United Demolitions, because the FBI and the DOJ don't really have a whole lot of originality, and if you start wondering, it should have been clear to somebody. And they set up United Demolitions to go after demolition contracts, to see what would happen, I guess. They got a contract. When they got that contract, I've got it on the blog somewhere, but their performance was subpar, and the city said they were never going to use them again. Next up, Williams goes on about Sorrell a little more and said that he was a up-and-comer and he would do a little extra to look good, and they were looking into him. Sorrell got a lawyer, and became silent afterwards. He's working as a consultant now. He used to be working for the city. Anyways, they talk about Tim Reardon, who was the city manager, and that Reardon started thinking that Sorrell had issues with minority employees, and that Sorrell was also in charge to get away from community priority boards. Anyways, so then we talk about Lachey Smith, the former head of Parks and Rec, who was moved over to serve as the director of finance, and that Smith was by the book. And he remembered when Commissioner Mims used the wrong credit card for city business, and Smith sent out an email blast regarding the incident. Whaley questioned Smith of her decision to send out a blast about the incident because Mims and Whaley were like this. And of course, Mims stepped in for Whaley when she dropped off the mayor's race. Now, we'll get to that in a minute. There's also talking about Shelley Dickstein, Joe Parlett. Shelley Dickstein was the city manager. Parlett has moved up to the assistant city manager. Parlett was, at that time, head of Parks and Rec, and promoted to assistant city manager. And then they asked Williams about Higgins. And this is where Joey lies. He said he did not know Higgins very well. First met him through a private banker, Nicole Johnson, with Chase Bank. Joey used to be the local president of Chase Bank. Higgins was Johnson's client. Higgins at one time had a hot bar and restaurant downtown. He was involved with a service at the transport dead bodies. And Higgins portrayed himself as dripping in money. And then Dr. Michael Irvin made the Williams aware of issues with Higgins, hadn't paid his employees, etc. And then Higgins had a relationship with Debbie Lieberman and Judy Dodge, and talks about Higgins opening Quincy's. And one of the great things in here is Williams said Lieberman had a reputation as being an alcoholic. The CHS said Lieberman had a diva-like reputation, and had her husband, Dennis, the former chairperson of the Montgomery County Democratic Party, and that Lieberman and Whaley were always at odds, and that neither was an ally or an enemy. This is fascinating stuff. I published it, not the exact copies, a year later when the Dayton Daily News let go of some of the stuff that when they unsealed some of the warrants. I got warned that I shouldn't have published it, and it was up to me to destroy all those documents. Part of the reason was Williams, was that Higgins had gone and sued Mike Marshall and included some of the discovery in his filing against Marshall. Now, this is where things get interesting. Marshall didn't have any connections. Marshall was basically a loser demolition guy. He met Higgins, who had experience with having government contracts and doing minority contracting. Higgins then introduced Marshall to Roshan Winburn and to Joey Williams. Marshall and Williams sat at the brunch club down here, a breakfast club at the corner of Patterson and Maine. One morning, on tape, and Williams sketched out what he wanted Marshall to build him, which amounted to about a $40,000 patio enclosure on his house. Now remember, this is a bank president who's married to a television news anchor on Channel 7. They're not exactly poor. But his reasoning was everybody else is doing this, so he was going to go in and try to get his little scrape. So they have this napkin drawing, they go ahead and do it, and this is how Marshall is gaining Williams' support. And where the money came to do this addition, nobody really knows, but it is suspected that it came from the money that Higgins got because he had a leaky fish tank in his $1 million house in Meeker Creek, on Meeker Creek. I have been in that house. It was a big fish tank. I saw the damage. I offered a friend who was a great contractor. Brian said, no, we've got this under control. And what was going on was Brian was hiring people off the street to do some of the work. He was hiring Mike Marshall to do some of it, or claiming Mike Marshall did some of it, and submitting invoices to an insurance company that was covered by force-placed insurance because Brian was broke and wasn't paying on his mortgage. He was squatting in a $1 million house. This force-placed insurance never should have been giving the money to Higgins directly. They should have hired the contractors, done the work, pushed him out of the house, sold the house, whatever. But no, they gave it to him. The first draw. That money might have been the money, $40,000+, that they used to build Higgins his enclosure. Then Higgins, Winburn, Williams decide, together with Marshall, they're going to set up their own company called Airborne, because again, Brian was a paratrooper. Apparently Roshan's a veteran too, but I'm not sure the details. And they're going to set up this company, and Roshan's going to recommend them. Williams is going to get the 3 votes it takes, and they're going to make millions. They're all excited. This is on tape, including when Roshan Winburn is explaining how they're going to use Ring Central so that their cell phones work and sound like they're in a big office when in fact they're not. That they will know they're getting calls for airborne demolition and to answer it that way. So they need more money and they need another draw from the insurance company. So Marshall and Higgins do their thing in like a record 11 days and get enough done that the insurance company sends out an inspector and they grant them the second draw of another $40,000. Insurance company did their due diligence. The insurance company gave them the money and said that they were X number of hours in. They're seen celebrating in a clip the FBI played over and over in the Higgins trial. Oh, look what we did. In 11 days, oh, we're all happy. What they never explained was that Marshall and Higgins were working together. The way it came out was Marshall was just along for the ride on Higgins defrauding the insurance company. No mention to the jury whatsoever. None of this conglomeration, this corporation that they were going to form to get demolition contracts. So, we have Joey Williams get lawyered up. He gets David Greer to be his lawyer. They work out an agreement. He pleads guilty to 1 count of bribery in office, and he gets a year in federal prison, reports to Ashland in Kentucky, and serves 3 months, and COVID hits, and they let him out. Clayton Lucky lawyers up. He gets 4 months, does 3, gets out. Roshan, who accepted bags of cash, like $6,000 from Marshall to move things along, he gets to stay on house arrest the whole time. He's never taken in. He's allowed to work, even though he's got an ankle bracelet. He goes to work for a local nonprofit. And they cover for him. And after a while, judge says, oh, you've done enough. You know, we're going to let you loose. This was only about a month ago. And then all of a sudden, the proverbial poop hits the fan because he gets caught hooking up cell phone cameras to transmit video and pictures of someone who he knew who is underage and female in various states of undress. He got picked up yesterday and put in jail with a $100,000 bond. There's going to be a trial on this, but more than likely he's going to end up having to do his 6 months from the federal court because he's a bad man now. But again, Higgins, I sat through the entire week-long trial. They took him in directly in court. Even though he'd been out for a while, been on house arrest, done everything right, he seemed to be a threat of flight. They took him directly in and sentenced him to 3 years for supposedly stealing from an insurance company. They said $120,000. I only heard of 2 draws, so $80,000. But regardless, the insurance company and Brian Higgins, that's a private civil matter. That is not a federal crime. Their defendant, their informant, Mike Marshall, admitted he was a dishonorably discharged veteran and he was working for the FBI. Now, I hope you followed all that mess, because here's the most important part. Williams was caught 1 year in. That's the date on these papers, okay? It is clear that on October 16th of 2015, Williams had been confronted and had flipped to become a confidential human source. He finished 3 years in office under the control of the FBI. And he stood for re-election. I'm going to say that again. He stood for re-election, even though he had committed felony crimes in office. This is election tampering, people. This is what Donald Trump and all his people keep talking about. No, this is the feds running a Manchurian candidate, a candidate who is not in control of his life for office. They had an agreement that Williams would resign if he got reelected. He came in first. Second came Mims. Third came Darrell Fairchild, and fourth came my friend Shanice Turner-Sloss. I think I was on that election ticket too, but I can't remember. No, I don't think I was on that one. So, he resigns. They schedule it at the same time as the primary was going to be, so it didn't cost us a lot more for the election. And the city is torn between Fairchild, the Reverend Darrell Fairchild, and the Reverend Darrell Ward. Fairchild prevails by 500 or 1,000 votes and serves out the remaining 3 years of Joey's term. And then gets reelected. Just remember, Mark Owens, chair of the Montgomery County Democratic Party, sent out smear mailings against both Fairchild and Shanice Turner-Sloss, calling them socialists and communists and whatever else, under the guise of the Democratic Party state ticket. That's one of the reasons Owens is no longer the party chair. He's just been replaced by Mohammed Al-Hamdani, who was elected last to the Dayton School Board. And before he was even sworn in, was holding illegal secret meetings. And you can see that on my blog. And I ended up in front of Judge Dick Skelton, who refused to have a court hearing. So he got away with having illegal meetings that Mims knew was illegal because he stayed out of the buildings knowing it was a violation of the Sunshine Laws. So did John Gower. So we've got all these people who've done all these things, and I filed lawsuits and I've sat through. But what the last straw was when I found out, because Dayton's a small town, was that somebody that I know was on the grand jury. And they had heard repeated tapes of Nan Whaley, and their comment was, "Ooh, she's dirty." What do you mean by that? Oh, I was on the grand jury and I heard her over and over, and she's dirty, quote unquote. So I say, okay, let's get a FOIA request in, a Freedom of Information Act, and ask for the tapes. Now, normally, there's protection of grand jury material. It's all top secret, hush hush. However, when it involves public officials doing crimes, that would be a very convenient way to hide them. So, in 1987, Ruth Bader Ginsburg on the 12th Circuit had a case titled Senate of Puerto Rico versus the Department of Justice, where she basically said, nope, grand jury stuff when it's public officials, it is not a veil of secrecy. It is not a cloak that covers all bad things. So I cited that law. The FBI and the DOJ pretended that they weren't working together, even though their names are all over these things. Tried to say that I didn't perfect my appeal because I only did it once through the FBI or through the DOJ and didn't do it through both of them. And they're claiming what's called the they're using an excuse, we cannot confirm or deny. The Glomar excuse. The Glomar Explorer the Global Marine, was a ship being built in secrecy by the CIA in LA during the Vietnam War. And when somebody started asking questions about this ship, that's when the Glomar response came up. We cannot confirm or deny what is going on. And it was a big deal. They've been getting away with using that for a long time. It does not apply in this case. I could not find a lawyer to file it, so I filed it myself pro se. The first judge who had it sat on it for a long time. But that was Stephen Newman. However, while he was sitting on it, he unsealed the warrants for Nan and for Willis, and people said, oh! And at some point, one of the FBI and PR people said, oh, this investigation is no longer going. And Nan says, oh, no, it's over, and I didn't get indicted, so I must be okay. Turns out, the FBI is now telling the Dayton Daily News that's not the case. The PR person misspoke or didn't speak correctly. So I file this thing. The first judge recuses himself. It gets sent over to Thomas Rose. Rose has to recuse himself immediately because when I was sitting through the Higgins trial, they were very careful about where I sat and what I did. And Rose actually called me into chambers without any of the jury there and bitched me out for 5 minutes straight because I was trying to find out from them what was going on because I was being told where to sit, when to get up, when to go to the bathroom. And I didn't think that was correct. So Rose recuses himself. It then goes to a judge in Columbus who was implicated in, got the Ohio State athletics case with the sexual offenses and failed to disclose that his wife had contracts with Ohio State. He disposed of it. So we had 3 federal judges recuse themselves, and then the 4th one got it, And she immediately used administrative law, saying something about I didn't follow the proper procedure, and dismissed it. I have appealed to the Sixth Circuit. We will see when the Sixth Circuit decides to respond. The reality is, I think the people in the state of Ohio have a right to hear those tapes of Nan Whaley. Now, I'm going to say right up front here, I would vote for Nan Whaley over Mike DeWine every day. No questions. Nan Whaley will not take the rights of women to have choices over their body away. Nan Whaley will not basically say anybody can have a gun and conceal it. So Nan Whaley gets my vote. Mike DeWine is dangerous, as are most of the Ohio Republicans, because in this gerrymandered state they've had a supermajority and can do as they please, which has led to some really horrific legal decisions and laws being passed. But I think the public has a right to know what Nan said and what's going on, because the fact is she dropped out of the mayor's race a few days before the primary, the turn-in date, and Jeff Mims had to scramble, and they had to find somebody to fill Jeff Mims' seat, so they ran Scott Sliver and Stacey Benson Taylor, who both lost to Shanice and Daryl. Thank God for that. So we have Joey Williams running a restaurant with a liquor license downtown. We have Roshan in jail. We have Clayton Lucky sort of nowhere. We have Brian Higgins in federal prison. The Camerons paid a fine. Roush paid a fine. And the whole thing just disappeared. But anyone who knows anything about how anything works in Dayton knows it takes 3 votes on the city commission to make anything happen. It also takes a city manager to present that stuff to the city commission for approval. It takes people in purchasing. It takes people in contract and legal and contract reviews. It takes somebody on the Minority Business Council to check all the boxes. There is more to this story, and we're not being told. Now, a long time ago, I made a big stink out of Ryan getting $10,000 and Nan getting $5,000 from a guy who owns the Vance Road landfill. He lives in Columbus. His name was Kit Cooper. That never seemed to set off any alarms for people. But the reality is demolishing properties in Dayton has been hugely profitable. A lot of federal money goes in there. And a lot of people have been sucking on that tit for a long time. In fact, before they decided to build US 35 West, which is now named after C.J. McLin, he told a whole bunch of his friends where to buy property, so that when the state came through and took it by eminent domain, they would get paid top dollar. His daughter, Ryan McLin, also bought properties on Bank Street, same spot. They made money. This is not small potatoes. This is not something new. This is our culture in Montgomery County, and it's been that way for a long time. There is a royalty. The fact that I found out that Deb Lieberman's assistant was steering contracts for public health to her ad agency of record for her campaign and outed it, and also believed that her assistant was working for the Wilderness Agency, were proven true 8 months later when he resigned and announced that he was the chief operating officer and a co-founder of the Wilderness Agency, which had started years before. I combed through 2,500 pages of documents where people in public health were asking the same question. They also did work for the Board of Elections. Lieberman doesn't think it's a problem. John Theobald, the person who was her assistant for years, the one who was the co-founder of Wilderness, quote unquote, he got named to the Montgomery County Veterans Service Commission just like that, which is $10,000 a year for 2 meetings a month. Nobody's investigated any of this. The corruption is prevalent. It is all over. And it's one of the reasons Mike Turner doesn't get involved in anything other than the base, because he doesn't want to get his fingers dirty like the rest of them. The reality is, we've had things happen in this community that are absolutely ridiculous, besides the fact that Joey Williams was allowed to stand for re-election. How about the fact that Adil Bagirov, who got elected to the school board unopposed, wasn't living in the district for at least 2 years and they would do nothing about it? That he steered contracts to to the same trucking companies that he did business with his trucking firm. That he committed voter fraud saying he lived on Maryland Avenue because he wanted to be in the voting district to run against Steve Henney. Turns out he never disclosed a bunch of things on his ethics statements. His financial disclosures didn't mention some private corporations that we uncovered, which led to connections with the Azerbaijani laundromat, which was a huge article put together by the Guardian in the UK, which exposed how the country of Azerbaijan was funding people in other countries to help their reputation. And there's a lawsuit now in Montgomery County courts trying to get the millions that were poured into Bagirov's pockets to make a film about the Nobel brothers. The stories are just phenomenal, and nobody else has covered them except for me. Now, Turner can write me off and says, well, his own party didn't endorse him. Well, there's good reason, because the way the party works, the people who are in office have patronage jobs they give out. That's how they have a woman who works at the Board of Elections who hires her convicted rapist brother without a job posting and without an interview or an application. That's how things roll around here. It's the Friends and Family program. And I have been exposing it for years. The fact that Turner funneled contracts to his wife's firm for the Dayton Development Coalition, spending over $1 million for a campaign that absolutely was dead in the water called Get Midwest. I've covered that. The fact that his wife did work for the Army Corps of Engineers while he sat on the Defense Appropriations Commission. And that he did work for the Home Depot Political Action Committee in Atlanta, despite them being here, as a way to funnel dirty money into his family. He got divorced from that wife, and she moved on to another state, but he moved on to another wife who was a lobbyist, and that didn't end well, but it's all been sealed, so we can't find out what happened. But him and Daryl Issa, who used to be his best friend, aren't really friendly anymore. You know, I don't need to be liked. I need to be honest. I need to be respectful and respected. Because when I ask questions, I expect honest answers. Like why the FBI and the DOJ aren't in a lot more trouble for running a Manchurian candidate in Williams. I think we need an answer to that first and foremost. I'd like to know why Debbie Lieberman is still in office, that she had to have had a part in that, and why John Theobald hasn't been put in prison. Because stealing from the public is just not okay. So, I've talked for a long time about the culture of corruption. I don't know how long. Oh my God, it's been a long one. Thank you to those who've stayed through. I don't see any questions. I do see Tam saying respect. But I would be happy to answer them. There's a lot that goes on here. It's documented on my blog. If you go in the links, you can get the actual documents. If this culture of corruption investigation is still ongoing, is Nan Whaley wearing a wire too, just like Commissioner Williams? Is she trying to entrap Democratic donors? I'd like to know. If there's still an investigation going on, how long are we going to wait? And how many more holes in the ground where Steve Roush demolished the old Dayton Daily News building and the Schwinn building and left it sitting there where we had to pay somebody else to come in and do it? And what about the $2.1 million the city awarded under Whaley to a company called Student Suites that didn't do anything for students and definitely wasn't sweet and was never forced to repay the money. Now, since I've been doing this citizen journalism since 2005, I've established a group of people, a network, so to speak, and a reputation for being honest and for keeping my sources hidden. I've talked to people who have worked at high levels inside these governments, and I've been told about times when Nan Whaley had people come in who were donors to tell them about what contracts were upcoming and how they could bid on them. I've been doing this for a long time. I can tell you there are things I have not been able to disclose. And it was no accident that I uncovered the John Theobald wilderness thing. It's that Richard Kaiser and John Theobald had crossed some other people, and some of them gave me the tips. That's how this works. If you come to me and tell me a story of corruption, I will do everything I can to publish it. You need another example? Take a look at the Kettering divorce attorney, Aaron Hartley, who managed to threaten to put a bullet in the head of a magistrate and stay out of jail. As I said, if you've done the crime, if you're a lawyer or a politician, you do a crime, you won't do the time, because we protect these people. And it's time to stop protecting them. I see Tina Marker in here saying, keep up the good work. And she'd love to see me debate Mike Turner. Well, Mike Turner knows better, because he wouldn't last more than a minute in a debate or even in a courtroom with me. Mike Turner, when he gets nervous, he starts displaying a tic. He talks a lot more. He doesn't make sense. I don't do that. And as your congressman, I'm going to make sure your tax dollars go in the right places. And I'm not going to sit there and use idle bullshit to blame people for things that they didn't do. Like, the inflation is not the Biden administration's fault. It's the Fed's fault. Let's be clear. If you're a billionaire and you have $10 billion in the bank and you're getting 1% interest, you're still making $100 million a year. If you have $10 billion and interest rate goes up to 6%, you're making $800 million a year. That's not chump change. Meanwhile, if you're poor and you have $20,000 in credit card debt and you were paying 12 or 14 or 16%, and now it's at 18 or 22 or 24, guess what? The rich are getting richer and you're getting poorer. It's time to fix this. It's time to elect somebody that isn't bought and sold and paid for by billionaires like Mike Turner. As I said, I don't even know a billionaire. He knows 19 of them. We'll get campaign finance reports for the pre-election here coming early next week. We'll do an analysis and we should know more. If you feel like you'd like to see somebody who's owned by you and not by somebody from out of state, remember 80% of Turner's money came from out of state, please make a donation. We still need them. We have a new spot that's going to come out next week that is dope. I'm going to call it that, dope, like a YouTuber. And it should be good for bumping up some people, not just me. I hope you have a great weekend. We've got signs to get out. If you need a sign, you can just send an email to david@electesrati.com. You can call the campaign. We'll deliver, or you can come pick them up at my office, 100 Bonner Street, Dayton. Really, what we need is people who live on main roads. That's the most important thing. And again, we need money for the campaign, because I didn't get the $2 million Desiree Timms did. So have a great weekend. It's awesome that those of you sat through all this complexity, sat through. And check the links out below. I hope that made it clear for somebody. And we will see you on Monday at 4 o'clock. Thank you.